What if a powerful kingdom didn't fall to war, famine, or invasion, but vanished because it discovered something in the desert that should never have been found? Stay with this, because what follows isn't just a story of disappearance, it's a warning written in sand. Keep watching closely, because once you see the pattern, you'll start noticing it everywhere. The desert where the kingdom once stood is now a place of silence so complete it feels unnatural. No ruins rise proudly from the dunes. No great walls mark the borders of a fallen empire. Only fragments remain, half buried and scattered, as if time itself tried to erase the memory of a civilization that once commanded trade routes, controlled water sources, and connected distant cultures across arid lands that most travelers feared to cross. Ancient records from neighboring regions describe this kingdom as disciplined, technologically adaptive for its era, and unusually stable for a society built in such a hostile environment. They mastered irrigation in a land with little rain. They built cities where others saw only death. They thrived where survival itself was a daily challenge. Their prosperity depended on understanding the desert rather than fighting it. They mapped underground water veins, followed seasonal wind patterns to predict sand movement, and built structures aligned to shield streets from heat and storms. This was not accidental development. It was knowledge accumulated across generations. The desert became their ally. Traders spoke of their cities as mirages that were real, places of shade, water, and order emerging from chaos. This reputation drew caravans, wealth, and influence. The kingdom grew not by conquest, but by becoming indispensable to those who crossed the vast empty spaces between civilizations. Yet even in this success, there were warnings. Old poems carved into stone near caravan routes speak of a horizon that whispers back. The phrase appears repeatedly in inscriptions older than the kingdom itself. Scholars later interpreted this as metaphor, a poetic way to describe the eerie acoustics of wind over dunes. But within the kingdom, the phrase took on a more literal meaning. Certain desert regions were avoided. Not because of bandits or lack of water, but because travelers claimed the land itself behaved strangely there. Compasses failed. Stars seemed slightly misplaced in the night sky. Sounds carried too far or not at all. The kingdom scouts mapped these zones carefully, marking them as regions of silence where no settlement should rise. For generations, these warnings were respected. The desert was studied, but not fully explored. The kingdom's rulers believed stability came from knowing when to stop digging for answers. This restraint is rare in powerful societies. Curiosity is often encouraged until it threatens comfort. Over time, however, success breeds overconfidence. Younger leaders began to question the old boundaries. They argued that unexplored regions represented untapped resources, rare minerals, hidden aquifers, ancient trade paths lost to time. In a competitive world, leaving territory unexamined felt like weakness. It began with small expeditions. Surveyors ventured into the marked zones, reporting nothing unusual at first. Sand, rock, heat. The familiar cruelty of the desert. Encouraged, the kingdom funded deeper exploration. This shift was subtle. There was no single moment when caution was officially abandoned. It eroded through policy changes, resource demands, and ambition. Each generation pushed a little farther, until what was once forbidden became merely inconvenient. The discovery that changed everything was not dramatic at first. A scouting party found what appeared to be an ancient structure partially buried beneath dunes. Not a city, but something far older and more deliberate. The stones were carved with symbols that did not match any known script from the region. The structure was not aligned with trade routes, water sources, or celestial markers familiar to the kingdom's scholars. It seemed intentionally isolated. This alone was unusual. Ancient builders almost always placed significant structures near resources or travel paths. Whoever built this place wanted it hidden. News of the find spread quickly among the ruling class. Curiosity ignited. This was an opportunity to uncover a forgotten culture, perhaps even a predecessor civilization that once thrived where the kingdom now ruled. Expeditions were organized. Scholars, engineers, and priests were sent to examine the site. What they found unsettled them. The structure extended far deeper underground than expected. The deeper chambers showed signs of deliberate collapse, as if the builders had sealed their own creation. This was not decay. It was intentional burial. The symbols inside depicted cycles of settlement and abandonment across vast stretches of time. Cities rising from sand, flourishing, then disappearing beneath dunes again. The carvings suggested that the desert had swallowed civilizations before, not through natural encroachment alone, but through patterns of behavior. Overexpansion. Resource strain. Ignoring environmental limits. The message was not mystical. It was historical. The desert was not just a place. It was a system that punished imbalance. But the most disturbing element was a set of inscriptions that appeared to describe something beneath the desert. Not a creature, not a god, but a process. A phenomenon triggered when certain thresholds of extraction, construction, and population density were crossed. The text implied that the desert itself responded to sustained pressure, shifting in ways that could erase settlements with alarming speed. This was not a curse. It was a warning encoded in stone by people who had learned the hard way. The kingdom's leaders faced a choice. They could interpret the discovery as a cautionary tale and limit further expansion into fragile desert systems. Or they could see it as an opportunity to outsmart the past. They chose the second path. The belief that modern knowledge makes ancient warnings obsolete is one of the most consistent patterns in human history. The kingdom's engineers believed they could control the desert's behavior through infrastructure, barriers, and predictive mapping. They viewed the collapse of prior civilizations as failures of technology, not failures of restraint. As construction expanded toward the newly discovered structure, subtle changes began to occur. Sandstorms became more frequent along caravan routes. Wells that had supplied cities for generations began to dry unpredictably. Wind patterns shifted, altering dune formations around settlements. None of this seemed catastrophic on its own. Environmental changes are often slow enough to be ignored until they compound. The kingdom adapted piecemeal, digging deeper wells, reinforcing walls, rerouting roads. Each fix addressed symptoms, not causes. The inscriptions in the buried structure were quietly removed for study. Some were archived. Others reportedly vanished into private collections of the elite. Knowledge that challenges growth narratives is rarely shared openly. It creates discomfort. The idea that prosperity could trigger collapse undermines political stability. So the warnings were reframed as symbolic myths, historical curiosities without modern relevance. Official narratives emphasized the kingdom's ingenuity. The desert would bend to human will, as it always had. What followed was not immediate disaster, but a slow unraveling. Trade routes shifted as caravans found the desert increasingly unpredictable. Cities experienced supply disruptions. Border regions were abandoned quietly as maintenance costs rose. The kingdom's center remained stable for a time, creating the illusion that the system was resilient. But resilience without adaptation is just delayed failure. At some point, records grow thin. Neighboring civilizations note reduced contact. Envoys sent to the desert kingdom report fewer bustling cities, more half-empty settlements. Then correspondence stops entirely. The kingdom does not fall in a blaze of conquest. It fades. Within a few generations, the trade hub that once connected regions becomes a blank space on maps. Later travelers describe stretches of dunes where stone foundations barely break the surface, as if entire cities were swallowed whole. The discovery in the desert was not the cause of the kingdom's disappearance. It was the moment they were warned, and chose not to listen. The desert did not awaken. It responded. Systems respond to pressure. Ecosystems respond to exploitation. Civilizations respond to the stories they tell themselves about control and permanence. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, that's because the pattern is not ancient. It repeats wherever societies mistake short-term mastery for long-term balance. The vanished kingdom is not a mystery of the past. It is a mirror held up to any civilization that believes it can extract endlessly without consequence. Stay with this story as it unfolds, because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that the desert didn't erase the kingdom. The kingdom erased itself by ignoring what it found buried in the sand. What if the kingdom didn't vanish overnight, but slowly disappeared while convincing itself everything was still under control? Stay with this, because this part reveals how collapse doesn't arrive as chaos at first, it arrives as normal life, slightly broken. Keep watching closely, because the most dangerous moment is when nothing seems wrong yet. In the decades after the buried structure was uncovered, the kingdom entered what later historians would call its age of adjustments. Nothing dramatic happened at once. No single disaster forced a reckoning. Instead, small problems accumulated. Wells that once supplied entire districts now required deeper drilling. Irrigation channels needed constant repair as sand shifted more aggressively with changing wind patterns. Caravan masters began rerouting trade paths to avoid regions where storms had grown unpredictable. Each change was framed as a temporary inconvenience, not a systemic warning. The ruling council invested heavily in infrastructure. Massive stone barriers were built to protect cities from encroaching dunes. New reservoirs were carved into bedrock to capture rare rains. These projects created an illusion of control. They also centralized power. Whoever controlled water and roads controlled survival. The kingdom's leadership grew more rigid as systems became more fragile. When societies feel environmental pressure, they often respond with tighter authority, not greater flexibility. Priests and scholars who studied the inscriptions from the buried structure began to notice disturbing parallels. The patterns carved in ancient stone matched what they were observing in real time. The sequence of early signs, the subtle shifts in wind and water, the strain on trade routes, it all mirrored the recorded stages of decline described by the forgotten builders. Some scholars urged restraint, suggesting limits on expansion and resource extraction. Their arguments were not mystical. They were practical. Reduce strain on water sources. Slow construction in fragile zones. Diversify settlements rather than concentrating populations around a few urban centers. These ideas threatened economic growth and political stability. The council did not ban the scholars outright. That would draw attention to the warnings. Instead, they reclassified the inscriptions as symbolic, not predictive. Funding for research into the buried structure was quietly reduced. Those who continued to speak publicly about long-term collapse found their influence diminishing. Not through punishment, but through neglect. Their voices faded beneath louder promises of prosperity. Meanwhile, the desert's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Storm seasons lengthened. Dunes migrated faster than expected, burying roads and outposts that had stood for generations. Some wells collapsed as underground water tables shifted. The kingdom responded with more engineering. Walls grew higher. Channels were reinforced. Each solution worked briefly, reinforcing the belief that technology could outrun environmental limits. This feedback loop, problem, fix, short-term success, delayed deeper change. Records from border towns reveal another shift. Populations began moving inward. Peripheral settlements were abandoned as maintenance costs rose. This migration strained central cities, increasing demand on already stressed water systems. Social tensions grew. When resources tighten, cooperation often gives way to competition. The kingdom's cohesion weakened not through invasion, but through internal pressure. The desert was not attacking. It was compressing the system until fractures appeared. There are hints that the buried structure became a point of quiet controversy among the elite. Some leaders wanted to seal it again, fearing that continued excavation symbolized defiance of the ancient warning. Others argued that more knowledge could unlock better control over the desert. This division reflects a deeper philosophical split: adapt to limits or dominate them. History shows how often civilizations choose domination, even when adaptation is safer. At some point, a severe storm event altered the political balance. Records speak of a massive sand movement that overwhelmed outer defenses and buried key supply routes. The event itself was not unprecedented in scale, but its impact was magnified by how stretched the kingdom's systems had become. Trade halted for weeks. Food shortages emerged in outlying districts. The leadership framed the disaster as an anomaly, but privately, emergency councils were convened. The desert was no longer just a challenge. It was a destabilizing force. Yet even in crisis, the kingdom doubled down on control. New projects were launched to stabilize dunes, redirect winds, and deepen water extraction. These efforts required more labor and resources, pulling people from agriculture and trade into maintenance work. The economy shifted from growth to survival mode, but the rhetoric of expansion continued. This disconnect between narrative and reality is often the final stage before collapse becomes visible. Foreign merchants began to avoid the region. Not because of danger alone, but because reliability had eroded. Trade thrives on predictability. When routes become uncertain and supply chains unstable, trust dissolves. The kingdom's role as a connector between civilizations weakened. With fewer caravans passing through, wealth declined. Influence faded. The once indispensable desert hub became a risk rather than an asset. As the kingdom's outward connections frayed, its inward focus intensified. Leaders became more secretive. Decisions centralized further. The inscriptions from the buried structure, once studied openly, were now confined to restricted archives. Knowledge that could encourage systemic change was treated as destabilizing. The pattern repeated: hide uncomfortable truth to preserve short-term order. By the time neighboring civilizations realized something was seriously wrong, the process was already advanced. Collapse rarely announces itself with drama at first. It appears as inconvenience, then inefficiency, then fragility. The desert did not surge in one great wave. It pressed slowly, persistently, exploiting every weakness the kingdom refused to address. And here's the unsettling part. The kingdom didn't vanish because it discovered something forbidden. It vanished because it understood the warning and believed it could outrun it. Stay with this to the end, because the final part reveals what happened when the system finally crossed the threshold the ancient builders tried to warn about, the moment the desert stopped being a background force and became the dominant actor in the kingdom's fate. What if the moment of collapse wasn't marked by fire or conquest, but by silence spreading across the desert routes? Stay with this, because this is where disappearance stops being slow and starts becoming visible. Keep watching, because this is the point of no return. The threshold the ancient inscriptions warned about was never a single number or event. It was a tipping point created by accumulation. Too many wells drawing from the same underground veins. Too many cities demanding stability from shifting sand. Too many roads cutting across fragile dune systems. When the system crossed that invisible line, the desert's behavior changed qualitatively, not just quantitatively. Storms became more chaotic, less predictable. Dunes no longer migrated in gradual patterns. They collapsed, surged, and reformed with alarming speed. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came from the central trade corridor. A route that had functioned for centuries vanished beneath a massive dune formation in the span of weeks. Not months. Weeks. Attempts to clear the sand were futile. As soon as workers removed one section, new drifts filled the gap. The corridor was effectively erased. This was more than inconvenience. It severed the kingdom's primary artery to external trade. Without reliable routes, the desert hub became isolated. Supply shortages followed. Food that depended on trade from more fertile regions grew scarce. Prices rose. Urban populations strained under uncertainty. People began to leave cities in small numbers, moving toward areas rumored to be less affected by the desert's instability. This migration pattern further destabilized outlying regions, accelerating abandonment. The system began to hollow out from the edges inward. Internal records hint at growing desperation within the ruling council. Emergency measures were enacted. Resource extraction intensified in an attempt to stabilize supply. Wells were drilled deeper, faster, with less planning. This only worsened underground instability. When systems are pushed beyond sustainable limits, attempts to extract more often accelerate collapse. The kingdom was now in a feedback loop. Environmental strain triggered crisis responses that increased environmental strain. The buried structure's warnings took on new significance among a small group of scholars who had preserved copies of the inscriptions. They compared the ancient descriptions to current conditions and found a chilling match. The sequence was unfolding as predicted. Infrastructure failure, trade collapse, population contraction, then rapid environmental reconfiguration. According to the carvings, once this stage was reached, reversal was unlikely. The system would reassert its baseline. The desert would reclaim areas overbuilt by human settlement. There are rumors of a final attempt to intervene. Some leaders proposed abandoning certain cities deliberately to reduce strain on water sources and dune systems, sacrificing short-term population centers to preserve the core of the kingdom. This idea was politically impossible. Leaders are rarely willing to admit that parts of their domain must be relinquished to save the whole. The plan was rejected. Maintenance efforts continued everywhere, spreading resources thin rather than concentrating on survival. As storms intensified, communication between cities became unreliable. Messengers failed to return. Caravans vanished in newly formed dune fields. The desert, once a mapped and navigable system, became unpredictable terrain. Isolation deepened. When systems rely on connectivity, isolation is catastrophic. Cities that could not exchange resources with others became fragile nodes, each facing collapse alone. Neighboring civilizations recorded strange accounts. Trade partners reported that envoys sent to the Desert Kingdom found abandoned roads and half-buried outposts. Some reached inner cities only to find them eerily quiet. Not destroyed. Empty. People had left, but not in panic. It was a slow retreat, a gradual recognition that the desert was no longer a partner but a force reclaiming space. There were no mass graves. No signs of violent conflict. Just absence. This absence is what makes the vanished kingdom unsettling. There is no dramatic ending carved into history. No final battle. No burning capital. The desert did not attack the kingdom. The system the kingdom depended on simply shifted beyond what human structures could sustain. When the desert's baseline reasserted itself, cities became unsustainable. People left, following water and stability elsewhere. Over generations, memory faded. What had once been a hub became a legend. What had once been a warning became a rumor. The buried structure's message was never about doom. It was about thresholds. About understanding that environments are not passive backdrops. They are active systems with limits. The kingdom discovered this knowledge, studied it, archived it, and then chose to test those limits anyway. The result was not punishment. It was consequence. If this feels eerily modern, that's because the pattern doesn't belong to one place or time. The desert is just one environment. The principle applies wherever systems are pushed beyond sustainable thresholds while leaders insist control is unlimited. Stay with this, because the final part reveals what little survived of the vanished kingdom's knowledge, and why fragments of their warning still echo beneath the sand today. What if the last traces of the kingdom weren't ruins to be found, but lessons to be forgotten? Stay with this, because what survived the desert wasn't stone or cities, it was a pattern. Keep watching, because this part reveals how erasure happens not just physically, but culturally. As the population thinned and cities were abandoned, the desert did what deserts do best, it erased. Wind smoothed foundations into dunes. Roads disappeared beneath shifting sand. Even the outlines of once bustling marketplaces became indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Without continuous human maintenance, the built environment dissolved into the landscape. Within a few generations, travelers crossing the region no longer recognized it as the heart of a former kingdom. It became just another stretch of inhospitable land, marked by the occasional half-buried stone that looked no different from natural rock. The disappearance of physical structures accelerated the disappearance of memory. Trade routes shifted permanently. New paths formed that bypassed the old hub entirely. Merchants who once depended on the kingdom found alternatives. Over time, there was no practical reason to pass through the region at all. The Desert Kingdom stopped being a place on the map and became a vague story told by older traders. Stories without relevance fade quickly. When a location no longer serves economic or strategic value, it loses its anchor in collective memory. What knowledge survived did so unevenly. Some inscriptions removed from the buried structure ended up in archives of neighboring civilizations. Others were copied imperfectly by travelers and scholars who did not fully grasp their context. Over centuries, meanings shifted. Warnings about environmental thresholds were reinterpreted as moral parables. The idea that systems respond to pressure was reframed as the desert being cursed or haunted. Practical lessons turned into myth. This is how technical knowledge degrades when its application disappears. Without living memory of the system it described, the message becomes symbolic rather than actionable. The buried structure itself did not remain untouched forever. Later explorers stumbled upon fragments of its entrance, half-buried and unstable. Most passed by, seeing only ruins without context. Those who ventured inside found collapsed chambers and scattered carvings, difficult to interpret without the broader framework the kingdom's scholars once had. The warning survived in pieces, but the logic connecting those pieces was lost. Knowledge fragmented is easier to dismiss. There is a quiet tragedy in this. The builders of the buried structure tried to communicate across time. The kingdom that found it tried to study it. Both efforts failed to preserve the full message in a form future societies could use. Not because people were malicious, but because memory requires continuity. When a system collapses, the knowledge about how to avoid collapse often collapses with it. In later centuries, some scholars speculated that the vanished kingdom had fallen to war, disease, or divine punishment. These explanations were simpler than accepting that complex systems can fail through cumulative strain. Simple stories are easier to remember than nuanced ones. Blame is easier than understanding thresholds. So the Desert Kingdom's disappearance was folded into the long list of lost civilizations attributed to fate rather than feedback loops. Occasionally, fragments of the warning resurface. A traveler's journal describing shifting dunes swallowing old roads. A scholar's note about inscriptions that speak of cycles of settlement and erasure. These fragments hint at a deeper truth, but without a living tradition of interpreting them, they rarely influence behavior. Warnings without context become curiosities. Curiosities do not change systems. The most haunting part is that the desert still holds the pattern. The environment continues to behave as it always has. The dunes still migrate. Water tables still shift. The thresholds still exist. The system has not changed. Only the stories about it have. When new settlements attempt to tame the region, they repeat the early successes of the vanished kingdom. Wells are dug. Roads are built. Trade flourishes briefly. Then the same pressures accumulate. The same adjustments are made. The same illusion of control emerges. The cycle resets with new names and new technologies, but the underlying dynamic remains. This is why the vanished kingdom matters. Not because of what it achieved, but because of what it failed to pass on in a usable form. The desert did not erase their cities alone. It erased the continuity of understanding that could have turned their experience into durable wisdom. If you're still with this story, don't stop here. The final part reveals the few remaining traces of the kingdom's knowledge that survived the erasure, and why recognizing patterns in lost civilizations might be the only way to avoid becoming one. What if the last voice of the vanished kingdom is still speaking, and we're just walking over it without listening? Stay with this until the end, because the final fragments of their warning are hidden in plain sight. Keep watching, because recognizing the pattern is the difference between learning from the past and becoming part of it. Long after the kingdom disappeared from maps, travelers and nomadic groups crossing the desert began to notice strange features beneath the sand. Subtle lines where dunes formed unnatural angles. Occasional stone edges exposed after storms. These were not ruins in the dramatic sense. They were the faintest fingerprints of a system that had once reshaped the landscape. Without context, they looked like geological quirks. With context, they were the ghost of infrastructure. In rare moments when storms stripped dunes down to bedrock, fragments of carved stone were revealed. Some bore symbols similar to those found in the buried structure. Most who encountered them saw only decoration. A few scholars recognized repeating patterns. Cycles etched into stone, diagrams of wind flow, markers indicating underground water channels. These were not monuments. They were technical maps disguised as art. The vanished kingdom had embedded functional knowledge into cultural symbols, perhaps hoping that even if cities fell, the patterns might survive as motifs. Over time, these motifs were absorbed into regional folklore. Patterns once used to indicate environmental thresholds became decorative borders in textiles. Symbols that marked unstable dunes became talismans for wandering spirits. The practical meaning dissolved, but the forms endured. This is how knowledge sometimes survives collapse, not as instruction, but as tradition stripped of its original function. Modern researchers occasionally piece together these fragments and glimpse the larger pattern the kingdom tried to preserve. When they compare the symbols on half-buried stones to those in ancient inscriptions from distant regions, they find echoes of the same warning. Environments respond to sustained pressure, and collapse is often a system-correcting imbalance, not a random catastrophe. These insights are rarely headline news. They don't fit neatly into stories of heroic rise and dramatic fall. They are quieter, more uncomfortable truths about limits. The desert remains indifferent to whether humans remember these lessons. It does not punish. It responds. When water tables are drained too quickly, they collapse. When dunes are fixed in place artificially, wind patterns adjust and create instability elsewhere. The system seeks balance. Human systems often seek control. The friction between these goals is where civilizations strain. The vanished kingdom is not a lost mystery waiting to be excavated in full. It is a pattern waiting to be recognized. Its greatest legacy is not buried treasure or forgotten architecture. It is a warning about thresholds, adaptation, and the danger of believing that intelligence alone can override limits. They did not fail because they were ignorant. They failed because they believed knowledge meant exemption. And here's the final twist. The most dangerous discoveries are not the ones that reveal new power. They are the ones that reveal limits. The kingdom found evidence of limits in the desert and chose to treat it as a challenge to overcome rather than a boundary to respect. That choice did not destroy them overnight. It reshaped their relationship with their environment until the system quietly rebalanced without them. If this story made you see lost civilizations differently, don't let it fade like their memory did. Follow for more hidden patterns in history, share this with someone who loves ancient mysteries, and keep questioning the stories we tell ourselves about control, because the next vanished kingdom won't be ancient. It will be whoever ignores the warnings written into the systems they depend on.